Welcome, Michelle.
It's so good to be here.
It's a treat to have you. And I really love your book. I tell you, who is like, oh, I love to talk about grief, right? But it's so good and it's so important and it's such kind of a taboo topic for some people. And so tell us what led you to write kind of different after you? Like, what was your journey? Because I know you've created so much around your loss.
Well, in 2005, my husband was killed in a cycling accident. I was 35, he was 39. We had a blended family of six. And so widowhood was not on my radar. I I was not only not on my radar personally, just not on my radar ever. I knew very few widowed people. I didn't think anything about widowhood. And so when the experience landed in my lap, I felt not only unprepared, but very alone. And on the one hand, obviously, logically, I knew I wasn't the only widowed person in the world, but it felt very much like the only widowed person in the world. And so that feeling of wanting to find other people who had lived through this kind of began a journey for me. It started with the idea that I might write a book, which is funny because this was 17 years ago now. And so it took a long time to get there. But that first thought of a book was just like, I would love to be able to gather people's stories and hear more about how other people have lived through widowhood. And then what that led to eventually was these interviews that I did that started a community. And so my focus really turned to the community of healing in community, being able to normalize the experience of grief and widowhood in community, being able to, I think of other widowed people as hope personified. When you see somebody who's lived through what you're living through, it's like, okay, well, that person seems like they've made their way. Maybe it's possible for me too. So after years of that, that led to an organization I founded called Soaring Spirits International, which provides community resources and programs for widowed people rebuilding their lives. And then finally, full circle came to all of the experience I've had connecting with other widowed people brought up this sense that many widowed people feel like they're less than they used to be when their person was alive. And I'd heard it over and over again. When am I going to be back to the person I was before? When am I going to be the same as I used to be? And it occurred to me that not only was that impossible, because we've learned some things, we've experienced some things that we didn't previously, and those fundamentally changed the way we look at the world, but also that we had this lower level of respect for the person we are today. Mm-hmm. Even though that person likely had to do some really hard things that we would never have imagined ourselves capable of. And so different after you is what I think of as my love letter to anybody who has experienced a trauma. And while it is focused on my own grief experience after my husband's death, I really wrote it with the intention of every person being able to define what you meant to them. For some people, that's going to be a diagnosis that changed the way they lived in the world. For other people, that might be a violent act. For some people, that's going to be a childhood trauma. For some people, that's going to be a death. But we all live through traumas in our lives and oftentimes view ourselves as less than on the after side of that. And so I wrote Different After You to help people find a sense of respect and a sense of pride in the person that they've become after whatever it is they've lived through.
Beautiful. Yeah, it is such a journey, right? And so isolating because, after loss, you can look out and you're like, how are people driving their cars? Like, how are people like walking their dogs? Like, my dog just died, my family member just died, whatever it is, and it's just it's so confusing. It's so disorienting. And, one of the pieces that I find interesting, I lead pet loss support groups and and just with my clients, my psychotherapy clients, talking about cumulative loss, right? So how every loss builds on the other. You're like, oh my God, as we get older, it's like going to be really intense. So can you speak a little bit to cumulative loss and what you've noticed in your experience?
Absolutely. It's interesting that we begin there because when I first started writing this book, well, that had the idea for the book, my only death experience, personal death experience is my husband. And in the midst of writing the book, my dad was dying. And
Mm-hmm.
so, from the beginning, like actively dying through the end of the book, I turned in this manuscript while I was on duty during one of his hospice care uh, pieces of his journey. And so it reminded me that what we each and this I think is actually what's so important about allowing ourselves to be changed by what we've lived through is that we are going to experience a variety of types of loss in our life, right? And you mentioned it already. So let's say that you've experienced the death of your parent, and then you had experienced the death of your best friend, and then you experienced the death of a beloved pet. Like by the time you get to the pet, you're like, okay, like I've done all, and one builds on the other because each one has its own unique place. And so every grief experience has to be lived in its own way, unique to itself. But we learn something about ourselves and about grief in every one of those. And so if we allow ourselves to be changed by what we experience, we have access to what we've learned. So after our parent died and we're dealing with our best friend's death, maybe we know that one of the things that's most comforting to us is an opportunity to be outside in nature. And so what are you going to do? You're going to know, okay, go outside in nature. That's going to help. It's not going to solve anything, but it is going to help. And whatever you learned then would help you with the next one. And so often in our culture, especially as it relates to grief, I think we like to separate it from life and make it its own thing. It's way over there. And if nobody looks, then maybe you won't have to go there. And my thought, especially, and we explore this a lot in the book, is about integration, allowing every experience we've had in our lives to have a place in our lives, present, so that we have access to what we've learned as a result of that thing. And it's not, I always like to make this clear too. I don't think of it as, oh, that's why this happened, so that I could have learned something. That's not why. It happened because it was happening, right? There isn't a way. I've never found a way to explain that to myself that feels real. It is a part of life. It is what happened. But by allowing myself to learn from it, I get access to those tools for the future. And in the future, using those will make a difference to how I process whatever's coming next. And that was definitely true from my husband's death to my dad's death. I could know that I couldn't expect as much from myself. I judged myself so harshly after my husband's death because I couldn't multitask in the same way. I was feeling less motivated, and I thought, oh, there's something wrong with this version of myself. No, this version of myself was grieving. And when my dad died, I realized that there was going to be a period of time where I was going to be less able to multitask, where I was going to be maybe less motivated. And instead of saying to myself, oh, you're a lesser version, I thought, you're grieving, and this is a part of what happens.
Yeah, I love that. Being able to really hold yourself with the compassion. Because at the
Mm-hmm.
first time, of a big loss, it is disorienting. Well, it's always disorienting, but it's like, why do I feel like I'm in concrete? Why can I not get out of bed? There's all these things. And then the second time around, you're like, oh, okay, this is part of it. Like I have to be gentle with myself. I
Yeah.
need to work, I need to move through this, right? But without pushing. And so I think that's such a great reminder.
Well, and the other thing of it too, I think, is that those feelings of, why am I stuck in concrete? Like so often they turn to, self criticism, to even self hatred. People start saying, I don't like this version of myself. I'm less than I used to be. I am not as good as I once was. Grief has made me into something I don't like. But really, what it is we don't like the pain.
Mhm.
We don't like the fact that whomever or whatever it is we're grieving is gone. That's what we don't like. And that can so easily be turned towards ourselves. And so the better we're able to, I always think of it like this, if you were having a hard day and in your best friend, let's say, had the exact same circumstances and told you about it, how would you respond to your best friend?
Right.
Typically in a much kinder, more compassionate way than you might to yourself. And so being able to remind ourselves to speak to ourselves in our self voice, like we would to someone we really love, makes a difference to making space for the grace that we need to be able to make our way through whatever grief experience it is we're living.
Yeah, that's like so mindful self-compassion of you, right? Never pushing that,
Yes.
right?
And a hard learned lesson. And
Oh
I
yeah.
think that's my hope for the book, is to share some of the lessons that I learned And I cannot count how many times a widowed person has come to me and said, I don't like myself. Like, I don't like this version of myself. And often they're speaking about all of the ways that our bodies protect us, right? From the overwhelming understanding of impermanence that's difficult for us, even in our logical minds, knowing it's going to happen, to really comprehend. And so they don't like that they're forgetful. They don't like that they are overwhelmed. They don't like that they're sad. They don't like that, maybe they're struggling with an anxiety that was never part of their life before, or they were already very anxious and now they're just off the charts anxious. And so what they see is all of these telltale, often physiological signs of grief and overwhelm feel like their new version of themselves. And they're like, okay, take that one back, please. Right. Yeah, I'd rather have my other one or another one altogether. This is not what I signed up for. And so trying to normalize also what the physiological effects of a trauma, and it could be grief, but it could be other traumas as well, to remind us that our body's saying, shut down for a minute. I'm trying to process something that is currently incomprehensible, and that needs to be sort of taken in bite-sized chunks to be able to process.
Beautiful reminder. So you have a 7-step process. Would you kind of just walk us through some of the pieces and just, you don't have to do all 7 if you don't want to. Sometimes people are like, I don't even remember. I wrote the book 6 months ago. Do you know what I mean?
That's right. Am I going to have to recall all of the steps? Yes. I actually, what's so fun about this is that first of all, I have the book in front of me. So
perfect.
But also that people have often asked me about, like, how did you come up with these steps? And I'll be honest, I was on my spinning bike. So, just thinking about, like, as I was trying to lay this out, I'm a very practical person. I want people to take practical tools away from this book that they can use as they go forward and they're rediscovering who they are after they've experienced a trauma. And to me, the very first thing that was critical was acknowledging that we're not the same. Because I think for myself anyways, I initially thought, if I can't go back to being exactly the way I was before Phil died, then somehow I set up an adversarial relationship with grief, which meant grief was going to win. So in order for grief not to win, I had to be exactly the same as I was before. And what I learned was that acknowledging that I was different freed me to decide, who was I going to be next then? Because that acknowledgement is really the key. If we can't acknowledge that we are different, then we're constantly fighting that uphill battle of trying not to be different for whatever our reasons. Those were my reasons, but other people may have different reasons for wanting to be the person they used to be. So acknowledging is for me the biggest one. And then so the next step is grieving. And so in the book, I laid these out in an order that felt to me like one would lead to the other. And so, we are all typically careful of making sure that everyone understands that the grief experience is a messy line and there's no way you can draw a straight line anywhere really. But I did want this to feel like, okay, so start with acknowledging, because sometimes that's a hard thing to do. And you may need to work through the acknowledgement for a bit before you're ready to move on to what's next. And next is grieving, but it's not only grieving whatever it is, the experience or the person that has been altered in your life or removed from your life, but it's also grieving the person you used to be and allowing yourself, I remember thinking I was a very, Pollyanna in the way of naivete that I loved. I loved that I thought everything was going to work out all the time and that you could hard work yourself out of any situation. Turns out that's not true. I couldn't hard work myself out of my husband's death. And that was a shocking revelation to me in a sweet Pollyanna kind of way. But I miss that. I miss that. I don't have that anymore, and I'll never have it again because it's just not my reality anymore. But I think we don't often make space for grieving who we were. We focus our grief on whatever the experience it is that we're living through. And so the book makes space for, and so each of the steps has a couple of chapters. And each of the chapters is designed to sort of help you make your way through that step so that at the end of that step, you can say, okay, am I ready to move on or do I have more work to do here, grieving who I was? There's a few others, but I'll come down to the last one. I'm going to skip straight to the end. which is to own your phoenix. And for me, in every traumatic experience, there's that part where when you have come to a place where you can respect yourself, you rise. And in that rising is the power to utilize what you've learned, to create, to be present in your life as it is now, and to allow yourself to shape a future that reflects who you are today, rather than accepting the future that you might have had and you might have really loved. I want that future. And maybe parts of that future will stay, and maybe it will actually look very much the same. But having given yourself a chance to say, here's what's changed about me. Here's what I think I still care about. Here's what I know I still care about. Here's what I might care about. How do I craft a future with that person? And in that owning, I feel like that's where we get the opportunity to say, I'm creating something for this version of me. And this version of me not only deserves that, but is going to be an active participant in creating it.
That's such a great reminder of grieving who you were before it, right? Because you're never going to be the same. And so that's such a great reminder. One of the things that I was curious, and I know you have thoughts on this, is like, how do you best support someone who's grieving? We don't say it was God's will. We don't say it
no
happened
angels
for a reason.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
God didn't need any more angels. That's
right. Right. Yeah.
I think that we've hit upon it really, actually, in this idea of transformation of the new person, because one of the pivotal moments of thinking this was the book I was going to write was a wonderful, beautiful, bright, shiny wooded person who came to me and said, I want to know when I'm going to be back to my old self. And then she said, my family doesn't recognize or like me. And I thought, see, this is the thing. The best way you can support a grieving person is to sit with them in the messiness without trying to change or fix them. That's hard. And so that one sentence, it's as, and even for myself, I've been doing this for 14 years. And when my dad died, I had to keep reminding myself, like, don't try to fix mom. Don't try to fix mom. Like, you have to just be present. She has to make her way through her grief experience as I make my way through mine, and my siblings and everyone who loved my dad. So even I, having been in this, and I know you've been in this, knowing that it's like, okay, there's a space that we need to make here. But also, I think the key thing you can do is allow yourself to get to know the new person who was born through this experience. Because rather than keep reminding them that they're different, get to know who they are, how they're different, and how your relationship's going to shift around that. I think that's why so many people, you often hear that you lose friends in grief, and that you gain friends that you would have never imagined that you would gain. And so I think that there's that, because it's that pivotal point, who's going to take the time to get to know the person who's evolving through this experience, and allow them not only the space to evolve, but the open-mindedness to say, this is a new person. I had a widowed person recently say to me that she, for 20 years, had been working with children who were blind. She said, it's been my whole life, but since my husband died, I can't bring myself to do it. And so imagine the people in her life, right? They think she is the person who helps blind children. She's not sure if she is that person anymore. The people around her supporting that evolution. And what I said to her was, maybe it's time to step back and just wait and see if that work continues to pull you forward. You're going to know that it's just a break you needed. Or if it doesn't feel like that fills you up in the same way it used to, maybe something else will be called forward. But unless we ask the question, is that still a passion of mine? And if the people around us support us in that, rather than say, but this is what you do, this is who you are, understand that the grieving person is evolving, and that grief will, just a grief experience alone, let alone, any other trauma that may be associated, as we mentioned, the combination of experiences that may be, coming together and coalescing in this one grief experience, let alone all of that. We know that that's going to create an evolution, and that there will be some changes for this person. And if we can allow that, welcome it, but as a key, get to know them in that. I think that's one of the best ways that we can offer support for someone as they try to get to know themselves in the midst.
And the piece that you mentioned, like about the woman who had worked with those children, it's like you do kind of step back existentially and you're like, what do I want? What am I doing? Why am I spending my time on this? And not that you don't like still appreciate it, but it may be part of the old you. And
Yep.
so I think that's such an important piece. And the other thing that as we talk about how to support people in grief, you know, last year I lost a beloved dog, and I remember I got like a I'm sorry for your loss card maybe 3 months later from one of my friends. And it was so intentional though. And she said, I know you get a lot of support, when it happens, which you need, right? But sometimes like it falls off. People, forget. And so I just wanted to reach out and let you know I was thinking of you, blah, 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 with a little time that had passed. And I thought, wow, that is like so incredibly thoughtful, right?
Mhm.
So, and then I think too, we have to remember to ask people, how can I best support you? Because sometimes we think, oh, I need to do this or that or that. And then, other times people are like, it's like, this is
Well,
what I need.
and also knowing that, as people go through, first of all, sometimes we don't, sometimes we know what we need, sometimes we don't know what we need, but being willing to evolve through that with you. I feel like that allows people to continue to be in relationship. And, what a thoughtful thing for your friend to do, because how can one evolve in 3 months?
Mhm.
This is, these experiences tend to come in, these packaged times that people think, okay, probably it's going to be fine by fill in the blank amount of time. And not only do the people around us think that, but oftentimes we find ourselves thinking that as well. Oh gosh, it's been so long. I should be better by now, or I should be fill in the blank by now. And I think when we can see this as an evolving process and that we have to learn about ourselves and what we have, how what we've experienced is changing for us, perspective, passions, likes and dislikes. One of the key messages in the book is ask questions.
Mhm.
Ask yourself questions. And then maybe the answer is the same as it was, and that feels completely fine and great for this new person. But every once in a while, I promise you're going to get a question and you're going to say, I don't know if that still feels right for me.
Mhm.
And so that's the hope, is that this will encourage people to start exploring this new self that was born through whatever it is that we've lived through. And,
Mhm.
I'm sure you've heard this, but so often when a pet dies, someone's like, okay, well, are you going to get a new dog?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, okay, oh, so did you get a new dog? It's like, okay, so, but I need some time to decide what does that look like for this version of myself, because
Mhm.
I've lived through this. I need a minute. And then I need to ask myself these questions to say, do I want to have a new dog? What would that look like? There's the space for questioning, I think, is so important in grief and trauma, because we need to be able to, like you said, do we know what we need? Maybe. And the only way to find out is even to ask ourselves questions.
Yeah, as you mentioned that, are you going to get a new dog, right? So, and you probably about disenfranchised grief, right? How like, and that just means this, but just for our listeners, that society doesn't know how to handle this loss, like a miscarriage, the loss of a pet, the death of a former spouse, right? These things where people just don't really know what to do with it. And it makes it even that much harder, because you may be getting some cards, you may be getting some check-ins, but it's not the same as people bringing you food and a funeral or a memorial service. It's not usually there, so that you don't have the full process played out. And so it's just interesting to kind of think about this because you would never be like, you need to get a new mom. Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
Right? Like,
exactly. Yeah,
so
you
yeah.
wouldn't. And like you said, not only do people not really know how to support someone experiencing disenfranchised grief, but they also have a tendency to minimize because it doesn't, because it doesn't fit into the standard of what people expect you would grieve over. And oftentimes I think for people who've not had their own personal grief experience yet, that's close enough to them to help them understand how grief transforms us. And, they sometimes we engage in that crazy thing, where we're comparative grief, whose is worse. So I think it's interesting to just bring to the conversation that disenfranchised grief comes with the added challenge of not only not being recognized, sometimes not being able to have people support you, especially for a longer term, but also having the potential for it being minimized in ways that can be really painful because we just don't have language for it, and we don't have an understanding. It's also a great example, like you said, of a ex-husband, wife, a former spouse of any kind, a former partner. Why would you be grieving that person? You didn't even like them. All of that, sets aside the fact that as humans, we grieve and we have complicated and complex feelings about all kinds of things. But anytime you have begun with love, it's very likely that there will be grief that follows, because love and grief are tied together in a really beautiful and painful way.
Yeah, so well said. My last question for you, Michele, is the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour. So I'm curious, I usually ask, how do you find tranquility in your everyday? But I'm wondering if you would share maybe some ideas on how you would encourage someone going through grief to find little pockets of tranquility in their day.
I think that you've hit exactly the right tone, which is pockets. I think sometimes when you're grieving, your experience feels so big that it doesn't seem like there's any way you can find tranquility. And oftentimes, the word peace is also used to express tranquility. And so peacefulness for grief is like, oh, I'm not going to be at peace with this. And so we fight it sometimes. And so I encourage people to find moments in their day that are comforting. And so, for me, it was that hot cup of coffee in the morning. It was like the time where like, okay, I don't know how I'm going to deal with the rest of my day, but right here in this moment, this is good. I can start with this. And so whatever that is for individual people, instead of telling yourself, I'm trying to come to a tranquil place that I will continue to have for the long term, which might feel too big, is to make it really small and set yourself, a list of things. Legit, write down a list of things. Here are 5 things that lower my blood pressure. Here are 5 things that make me feel for a moment calm. And then put those on your refrigerator, put those somewhere where you can see them, so that during your day, you're like, okay, I'm going to do one of those 5 things. And that moment of peace and tranquility can stretch. And so then we start tying them together until we feel like, suddenly I'm feeling a little bit more tranquil. I'm recognizing that I can create that tranquility for myself, even and especially during traumatic or tumultuous times.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michele, for being with us today and for writing this amazing book.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It's wonderful to have you. I appreciate your wonderful outlook, and the podcast is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.